Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Fresh Perspectives webinar brought to you by First Person. If everybody can hear me and see me all right, give me a big old thumbs up in the chat on the right side of your screen, just like I just sent. And if you're new here, feel free to give us a wave. We have Gary Dick from Inside Indiana Business, who needs no introduction, and Brian Brenner, the CEO and founder of First Person, with us. So if you're hearing and seeing us all right, give us a big thumbs up. Thank you. And also, you'll see in just a second, you'll see Rebecca Ellis, who is our managing director of the Performance Lab at First Person, and Megan Nail, who is our newly appointed VP of our Total Rewards practice. She is also here with us. So before I hop off camera and introduce everyone here, they will hop on after me. So it looks like everybody's hearing and seeing me all right from all the thumbs up and evidence in the chat. Feel free to send in your questions in the chat as we go along on this webinar. As you guys know, we are very responsive to that. So Gary will lead us through that, through the questions and our respective answers from Brian, Megan, and Rebecca. But again, feel free to send those questions in the chat. Otherwise, Gary, I will let you take it away, but just a little intro to him. He is the creator and host of Inside Indiana Business, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with his TV show and all of the other content that they produce over there at Inside Indiana Business. A proud partner of First Persons, and we're glad to have you moderating this panel, Gary. I'll let you take it away.
All right, Jimmy, thank you very much. And good afternoon, everyone. Great to have you all join us. And I know we'll have more joining on as well as the afternoon goes on. I just think that the topic, the title, Managing Change in a Time of Uncertainty, there could not be a more relevant topic right now, I think, for all of us, no matter what size of company we are involved in, our customers and others. There's so much uncertainty now, and especially as Indiana begins to reopen and that quote unquote back on track plan by Governor Holcomb, which continues to unfold leading up to a July 4th, hopefully full opening of sorts, if you will, for the state of Indiana. So many companies doing so many different things, pivoting in big ways to change, whether it's manufacturing or products or whatever the case might be. Lots of examples of innovation going on around the state of Indiana, and innovative leadership during these times of uncertainty. And that's the topic that we have. Jimmy mentioned we've got a great panel assembled for you to discuss these very relevant issues. Brian Brenner, of course, is the CEO and the founder of First Person. And Brian, thanks for joining us this afternoon. Also, Megan Nail is Vice President of the Total Rewards practice at First Person as well. And Rebecca Ellis is Managing Director of the Performance Lab, which is a key part of operations there at First Person. So welcome one and all to this webinar. And I will just kick it off. You all are the stars of this webinar. I'd love for you to tee things up with your perspective on where we are right now with respect to the pandemic and reopening, and the decisions and the choices that companies and leaders around our state are needing to make. Brian, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Gary. I appreciate it, and welcome everyone. We're delighted to have you here. As we were developing out this topic, we spent a lot of time on a lot of the logistics that have come with this period of time, and boy, have there been so many. Hoping to just pull back a little bit and look a little longer term and think more strategically about where things are headed. I think the reality is what we're finding is there are really important leadership opportunities right now, because things that typically drive our business. I read an HBR article just yesterday. The title was "Good Leaders Can Overcome Institutional Inertia in a Crisis." And the premise was essentially that most of our outcomes are driven by our processes, the way people think, sort of the institutional stuff that makes us go every day. Suddenly, in the midst of crisis, those things don't work. and leaders have a real chance to step up and lead and create some new opportunities. So I like to look at that side of it and not just necessarily the downsides and the tough stuff, but there are real opportunities to create institutional change and an inflection point, which could potentially serve to make us more successful coming out of this.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm excited about that.
Yeah, Rebecca, what are you seeing around the state of Indiana, your interactions in this time of uncertainty?
Yeah, we have seen a lot of just rising to the challenge. I think many of the organizations that we're involved with have really found this as a time to double down their efforts on customer focus and, their cause or mission. So there's a lot of really good things that are happening. I think ultimately there's been a term around for a while called VUCA, which is a statement about change and the transformation that our world has been in for a while. And what VUCA stands for is that really we have more volatility, we have more uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And I think if you think about a pandemic, those variables are the truest they've probably ever been for us. And what we see in terms of leadership is that folks are having to really rethink the way that they engage, both with their employees and with their customers. And the vulnerability that we're seeing, if there's another VUCA that kind of goes with it, Brene Brown clearly has been super popular. A lot of her research, she's a scholar practitioner, and I enjoy what she writes. It's very accessible. And, leaders need to be vulnerable. They have never had a chance to be kind of a chief empathy officer, as my friend Catherine Coble calls it over at Borshoff. And helping people feel safe, like psychologically safe, and then of course physically from the health concerns that we have, I think is a new opportunity for people, and it gives a entree into conversations that were probably not always kosher in a business environment, right? The things that you ask about a person's psychological state and their well-being. So I think the empathy is a really big one. And then I think we've had a bit of a challenge for a while, I would say, since I've been in corporate environments, of this idea that the leader is a doer first, a chief kind of subject matter expert, and then they tend to people and their true leadership responsibilities. And I do think the pandemic, one positive outcome is that it's flipped that dynamic a bit, and that being a true leader, a strategist, a connecting of teams, collaboration, all of those things have become more important than what you know and the expertise that you bring to the table. So I think it's put a leader back in the right spot, actually, for how we need teams to be most effective.
Yeah. Megan, you're really on the front lines in dealing with so many folks real time during the pandemic. What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, Gary, great question. I mean, it's really, when I stop and I have the chance to reflect on this, I think it's really important that we think back to the beginning of the year where we had record low unemployment, not only in the state of Indiana, but in many places across the country. And just the magnitude of this crisis that we're faced with and the rapid way that it came about has really put employers in a tough spot trying to navigate the legislation along with the leadership elements that Rebecca and Brian both spoke of. What I've seen and what I'm attuned to is the fact that probably now more than any other time, we have the attention of our employees and our customers on how we do this, and we really have their focus. So it's important on all of us to build that communication and build that trust and really make sure that our messaging and our empathy and our vulnerability, as Rebecca mentioned, are out there so we take advantage of this chance to connect so that our employer brand at the end of the day comes out stronger. So that we're able to recruit and retain talent in the future when this hopefully passes.
Megan, when you talk about leadership, obviously communication, very important at any time, but especially during this pandemic. And obviously everyone working in remote environments now. what are some of the maybe the good examples that you're seeing of leaders effectively communicating, again, during these uncertain times when you've got a workforce and folks spread out?
Yeah, great question. I think that we've seen communication speed up and become more informal across various mediums throughout this. So I've seen, and I would put myself in this category a little bit too, that those of us who are maybe used to a formal communication style or have worked in organizations that have been very formal, where you would spend days, weeks, maybe even months on communication, and now has to be done within hours or even minutes. So I think you see a little more of that humanity coming through as employers are really coming through and having to communicate more quickly and more often. So I think more frequent touch points across different mediums like short videos, even social media, different engagement platforms has really helped employers engage with both their customers and their employees.
Mm-hmm. Rebecca, you touched on this a moment ago, but the role of the leader in an organization and how it's changed during the pandemic. Talk a little bit more about that, if you would, and what things that effective leaders maybe need to embrace now going forward post-pandemic or as the reopening occurs. What are some of those elements that leaders really need to embrace?
Yeah, I think when we start to ask people what's went well during the pandemic, they say they've never had such access and visibility, particularly with senior leaders, and they don't want that to go away. And so I think we have to really caution ourselves against the busyness that can come into our days, the calendars being so full, and just not being able to relate and truly connect with people. And so I think that frequent communication desire is going to only remain as high as it is right now. And asking those questions that are more personal, as I mentioned earlier. I also think casting a vision has never been more important. We know strategic direction is one of the items that gives you the best ROI. If you're to invest time in getting that clear, people know how to line up and help you get momentum against that big goal. And we've seen a lot of companies, we've helped ourselves, companies stand up these strategic plans that frankly are no longer very valuable, right? Some I think could just use a mothball activity, and I think some need like a true, complete reinvention, because what was important going to be important post-pandemic is different than what might have been planned. I've actually had some clients who've been able to pull up some very audacious goals because they were so digital oriented that they weren't quite ready in the market, and now the demand is right there for it. A 5-year plan actually with one client got advanced forward to today being relevant. And so I think we're going to have to really think differently about how we set goals. I mean, I think about these performance management plans and goals that people have written that they're probably being bonused against that are no longer relevant. And so we've got to get more real time, more short-term oriented, more focused on what we can deliver in the here and now, and more strongly attuned and listening to our customers probably than ever before, because those demands are changing, right? So what we're there to serve is shifting, and we have to be listening well to know what that is, both internally and externally.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the role of a leader, and in coming out of the pandemic, there are going to be some really unprecedented situations that leaders will have to deal with. Among them, and it was mentioned earlier, is just safety. I mean, there are going to be workers who are not going to feel comfortable coming back to the workplace. And I don't know who to direct this to in particular, but as you look at those kinds of issues that, haven't really had to deal with before, what are some of the what are some of the things that leaders will need to think about when dealing with not just the blocking and tackling of business that goes on a regular basis, but some of those sensitive issues that are going to be very real for some employees?
Brian, I think you're on mute. There you go.
I'll take that briefly, and then I'll flip to Megan because I think she's got some good context around vulnerable populations and people who have different kinds of health needs, how to deal with that. But in large part, I'll be candid. I think in good times as a leader, it's really easy for me to think about what I need and what I can't get and what I'm trying to accomplish, because I have, significant pressures, goals, lots of things on our minds as leaders. And this pandemic has, I'm almost embarrassed to say, it's tuned me into the vast differential of needs that exist among our people from one to another. And, we've seen high performers even perform higher. We've seen lower performers who are challenged become more challenged. We've seen, fears creep in that we weren't even thinking about or aware of because it wasn't on our minds. And so I guess I think as leaders, I hope that we can almost bottle this up and take it with us to have a true others focused, everyday mentality to think, what might people be needing to hear, to see, to be called to. And I think the more we look at those inflection points, which is probably a super consumerism type model, if you're a retailer and you're selling to people, a lot about them. You can laser in on they like green and, they'd like their shoelaces to be this versus that. How do we know that about our people? We're not maybe at that level of sophistication yet as employers. So, but I think we're tuning into it. And I think the remote work opportunity just gives us more of an opportunity to think about how might we do that when we can't physically look at somebody.
Yeah, Brian, I can tag on to that if that's okay with you, Gary. But I think, just as you said, Brian, engaging with empathy and vulnerability and really seeking to understand the other's point of view is really important, because I think it really can't be understated the level of complexity and the variety of perspectives and experiences we've all had throughout this period. And I know this is going to sound strange coming from an HR professional, but in this case, I think avoiding broad policies that really paint everyone with a single brush is really important, because they just don't take into consideration the very different circumstances that employees face. Now, with that, I think that we obviously need to have consistency and we need to be compliant and really think through how we're going to do that. But having that interactive process and having that discussion with the employees is most important. I'm a big fan in terms of navigating this of one-on-one discussion meetings, having a manager discuss with an employee and really engage. I think we all are used to having surveys in our lives, but again, there's such a variety of perspectives that go on with this, to the extent that I think managers can engage and build that trust around these difficult topics really sets a firm foundation for how to move forward for each person. So we put together a return to work meeting guide. It's just a resource that you can use on how you may want to structure a conversation like that. Also, just because it's near and dear to my heart, I have to mention, I know that we've worked with a number of clients who have been going through really difficult situations with furloughs and layoffs. And when you're thinking about your communication, don't forget those employees who have been impacted or furloughed who you're hoping to welcome back. Think about what your communication strategy is with them as well, and ensure that you're keeping that strong. We've also produced a survivor communication strategy, so that if you have had the unfortunate impact of layoffs, just think about how you might structure some of that communication differently with those employees who remain.
Yeah. Rebecca, I'll throw this one to you, but anyone can jump in. I'd just be interested in your perspective on the work environment, the workplace post-pandemic. So many companies have been forced to obviously work remotely. Some with great success, maybe others not so much. But a lot of speculation at what the workplace is going to look like in the future, and will there be a push to much more of that remote, distant type of work environment? Any thoughts on that regard?
Yeah, I definitely think this is going to shake up the open office concept. I know Google was a leader in that. My best friend who grew up in Southern Indiana with me happens to work for Google, and they are rethinking, right, how that works. And they've actually said they won't be going back to the office at least until October, but probably not till the end of the year because of what they need to re-engineer. So I think the office environment itself is going to take a transformation. But honestly, I do think most people, many businesses have found that they are as productive, if not more, working from home. And so I think we'll see more remote-based jobs, which actually gives us, from a talent perspective, maybe an opportunity to hire from further out in the state, right? And not maybe folks who just have a reasonable commute into our office. I also think there's some downside that comes with that, because it's harder to walk away from your work when it's at the bottom of your stairs, right? And so there are definitely some trade-offs, but more often than not, I think most of our folks are saying there's some pretty fairly significant adaptations they need to make to their physical space, but they're trying to really enable as much remote virtual work as possible.
Yeah. Brian, I'll throw this one to you, and then we'll move on to more of an employee focus. But in terms of, as Indiana, and I don't know if you have perspective on this or not, but as Indiana is beginning to reopen businesses on a statewide basis, some restaurants who've suffered obviously so dramatically during this beginning to reopen, but the state's beginning to reopen. Have you had any conversations with counterparts in other places or other states to get a sense for how Indiana is handling this, or Indiana is, going through this process of getting back to work? I think you're on mute, Brian. There you go.
CEO tape his own commercials and probably not let him be on the webcast, Gary. But journalism 101. My apologies. I would say that what I've found in the state of Indiana is that I think we've done a great job of communicating clearly expectations, and I'm not sure I've necessarily agreed with all of the expectations we've set or some of the timing. It's easy to pick at those things. There's not a lot of value to it, but at the end of the day, we've been clear. I think what the Indy Chamber has done to support businesses, what the city of Indianapolis has done to support business, and CICF, countless others, I think is impressive. It's how Indiana works. It's what makes us unique in this region to really, band together, support one another, and do in that way. I think other cities, certainly much larger cities, have a much more challenging time of creating cooperation. They have to do a lot more things sort of by the rule of the law. Rural areas have been much less affected. So there's definitely variations, but I'm very proud of Indiana's commitment one to another, helping not-for-profits, business, government, and especially these businesses that have been hurt so terribly. Indy Chamber rolled out a loan program well before PPP came down. I mean, I think things like that, Gary, I don't know what you see, but I think that's unique, and I got to believe it's going to pay off for us over the coming months.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. And you mentioned the Indy Chamber and that loan program, and there were at lower levels or smaller levels, other counties around the state. I can't count the number of counties who've established loan funds and stepped up and really proactively gone out to do it. You mentioned nonprofits, great organization locally, 913 Sports, which goes out and really connects with their business model is to use bikes as if you will, a health mechanism, but to really connect with students in schools, IPS and elsewhere. They totally shifted their business model to delivering food. So they're partnering with Second Helpings, with Gleaners and others, and again, just proactively making things happen. And I'm sure that's happening in other parts of the country, but there's an element of that I think is unique to Indiana as well.
I think it is. I think I liken it to what's happening at the corporate level with Lilly jumping out early with testing and the drive-through testing, and they did that from a corporate level. You think about the governmental institution like an Indy Chamber that's supported, and then to your example, what Tom's done at 913. I mean, those are remarkable responses, and I think as leaders, the one thing I've noticed through the beginning of this was we had to immediately pivot to creating short-term objectives while keeping the long-term in mind, staying true to ourselves and looking for what's coming yet, but pivoting to the short-term and just getting after it, I think is of high value.
Yeah. As we move on to the employee theme, if you will, empowering employees is certainly always important. It's talked about a lot and has been for a long time. but examples and maybe opportunities to empower employees during the pandemic. Have they been more plentiful, or more opportunities, more importance on empowering employees? Brian, I'll throw that to you, and anybody else can jump in as well.
You know, I think empowerment is a difficult thing to evaluate. And, you know, we've said it for years that we want that. We want people to kind of step up. There's no time like a crisis to let that happen in its full glory. And I think Catherine made a great comment in the chat. You know, we've been prepared for remote work. We've had all the right tools. I don't think we had to buy a single piece of equipment to make it work for all of our people. Not every employer was necessarily in that position, but many of us were. We just hadn't been forced to kind of do it. And I think what it's done is it's ripped the Band-Aid off of, you know what, it's a reality. It's a way people want to work. It's a good thing. And we've got to learn to build better trust. We've got to let that all sort itself out and not feel like we have to control it. Because what we've found is, and I think other employers would echo this, people who can manage through it and get the support they need and garner that are very successful. And then there's people who can't, and we have to just let those chips fall where they may, and then help everybody through it, you know, kind of together. Mm-hmm. Some people make it, some people don't. Some people are not cut out for it. But I think I guess what I'd say is our need to control as employers, we really have to pull that back and sort of let things develop and watch the tea leaves as we go, versus feeling like we have to force an outcome. I don't think it works.
Yeah, I'll add on to that just to say, from a brain science perspective. So those of you who don't know me, I'll just tell you I'm a nerd. I've been studying neuroleadership for about a decade, and there are some things we know about it that are required in order to get the brain to a full engagement state in employment. And we want engaged employees, but then we often do these things that automatically work against us in the way that we're created. And one of the models that I love is David Rock's SCARF model. And what SCARF stands for is status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And when I think about empowerment, that means status to me, like I'm important enough to have control, to get a vote, to be at the table. And autonomy means I can run with it, right? I get the decision rights. And we've been over controlling for those things, I think, for too long. And not trusting that people, if we give them the right status, will show up the way we want and make the decisions we want. And if we give them the autonomy, we'll go in the direction that we want them to go. And we've got to just get comfortable, because again, that's a state of brain, like literally how we're wired, that is necessary. And so I think this forces a little bit of that. I know there are still employers who want to see you working to believe you can work. And that's, you know, obviously we've broken some of those molds and some of those assumptions. I had a CEO tell me last week, he's like, I'm there now, but I wasn't. And, you know, I'm kind of embarrassed about that, but this has proven to me that I can absolutely trust people and they can be empowered. And it's been really releasing for him to know that people can definitely do what they need to do to get the right work done.
Yeah, great perspective. Megan, in your view, why is it so important, employee empowerment? Why is it so important now as, again, businesses or organizations around the state begin to really reopen?
Yeah, I think it's a necessity, and it goes back to that inclusion and flexibility. I think realistically, as we move into recovery, and we're already seeing this, we are going to have our employees continue to be spread out everywhere. You may have some in a physical workspace, some at home, some in different situations. So to kind of the points that Brian and Rebecca are making, we have to find advantage other than just physically seeing that person and the work. I see Ann just made a great comment in the chat. That's true too. I realize that not all jobs can be done from home. It's just not possible. But how can you be flexible within different schedules or within the working environment that you have to be accommodating as well? One topic that I'm really passionate about in general is setting clear performance expectations and managing through those expectations and rewarding appropriately. I think this is probably the best thing that could possibly happen to what is traditional performance management, because we're really forced to set those clear expectations and then give our employees autonomy to reach them, and then certainly hold them accountable if they don't, and reward them if they do. So I think it's a really positive impact on organizations and managers to get clear on what those expectations are, and then to coach employees to get there.
Yeah, and Megan, a comment that just came in on the chat a few minutes ago, talking about flexibility in the workplace. And I think you kind of touched on that earlier, but this person put in a comment. He works, I think, at a 24/7 treatment facility, and flexibility with schedules, flexibility in a number of areas, very important to the process and in keeping morale up among employees.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I mean, I think it's really important, kind of going back to walking in each person's shoes and trying to understand their perspective. You know, we've got people who are really, for whatever reason, are also looking forward to getting back into the physical workplace. That's their escape. That's where they maybe feel safe. That's where they're most productive. So I think, you know, recognizing the different nature of jobs, the different perspectives that people bring to those, and having that interactive dialogue and interactive process to hopefully get to the best result for everyone is very important.
Brian, certainly mental health is such an important issue and has been for a very long time in the workplace in particular. But now, given the dynamics and everything going on with the pandemic, the whole issue of mental health and dealing with that, and what companies and leaders should be thinking about from a mental health perspective as this reopening takes place.
Here on the side about Beth at Indiana Early Learning Indiana, and I was thinking, you know, there's a lot. The brain has a way of working where we do much better with possibilities than we do with things that are problems. And yet, you know, problems have to be solved. We all have them in our lives. We have them in our businesses. They can create real challenging situations for all of us. But if we can help people, to Beth's point, if we can help them see what's going well, if we can help them build upon their strengths and their hopes and dreams, I think that goes a long way to them actually then beginning to solve problems naturally on their own. And so I'll liken it to this other comment around the assisted living or 24/7 facility, where asking employees, you know, what they were dealing with at home and having small children, you know, focusing on what's important to them and that they want to really care for those kids and they want to feel like they're being great parents at the same time they're doing a good job, goes a long way into helping people feel like they are mentally well, they're getting what they need in life. And so I think as much of it comes down to that as it does anything, helping people see what's possible and staying focused on the good things that can happen even in the midst of challenges.
Yeah. Rebecca, the whole issue of culture in the workplace and the importance of culture in attracting and keeping talent, which obviously is a huge issue for companies all over the state, companies of all sizes. As you look at company culture in the post-pandemic era, any particular things companies should be thinking about? Is it an opportunity to really enhance or focus in on company culture and what it's all about?
I absolutely think so. I think culture can be a really soft, kind of fuzzy word. And for me, the best way to simplify it is the personality of the organization. And I think Drew had made the comment in our chat that people will begin to ask in interviews, how did you handle things when the shutdown started? Mm-hmm. You know, what did you do for employees? How did you care for them? How did you enable them? And, you know, I think that folks who have figured that out are definitely going to win in the long term. I think the cultures of agility and those that really do value innovation, and by that I mean they have acceptance and patience and expectation even for failing fast and learning from it. I think those are ultimately the ones that will win. The cool thing about this pause or reset that in some cases organizations have gotten is that it does give you a chance to create and kind of rebrand that personality in a reboarding type of process, you can actually create new norms for how you do work. And I think it was IBM that put out the kind of code of work. And it was like, I will not be upset about my coworker's dog barking in the background. I will not worry about whether or not someone has to have a baby on their lap during my Zoom call. And it was just kind of this whole list. Brian shared out with our team. And I'm like, yeah, those are the things that we do just need to get more transparent about, because when we say we value work-life balance, what does that mean, right? What concrete does that look like? So this is a great opportunity to either expand on things that have gone really well for your culture, or to nudge them a different direction if needed.
Yeah. Brian, anything to add on that? I know culture is very important to you and you're very focused on that. Anything to add on the importance, or perhaps added importance of culture going forward?
I think culture is a combination of sort of how we put ourselves out there and what we want to be, sort of what we're aspiring to, plus, added in each and every person's own activities, behaviors, mindset. So, the short-term challenge here is in, I think, allowing ourselves not to get off the hook on longer-term strategic planning or longer-range plans. We have to keep those in mind, but also to be realistic that we also have to deal with just what's short-term. That's just the reality of a situation like this. Any crisis causes that: personal crisis, world crisis, business crisis, relationship challenge. It's giving permission to say, let's be who we are, but let's recognize what's real. And I think it's also, connecting in different and new ways with people, being very intentional about how we connect with individuals to make sure that our culture is healthy, that people feel like, even in the midst of uncertainty and all the, the VUCA things that Rebecca talked about earlier, that in the midst of that, we can still make sure we eat what we need. And that's important, because otherwise we become fatigued. We start making, suboptimal decisions. We start to treat people in ways that don't produce what we want. And so it's keeping that big picture and the individual in mind, which is, I think, what leadership is.
Yeah. Brian, quick question. I don't know if you even know if you can answer it, but it's something I was just thinking about as we're doing this via technology at Inside Indiana Business. Our show has exclusively gone to Zoom and Skype interviews, and the use of technology is so important. Do you think it places companies, as you look at the state of Indiana, maybe in more rural settings or non-urban areas, at a disadvantage going forward from the connectivity standpoint? Technology has always been important, but I mean, going forward, it's going to be even more so. I mean, does that present some challenges for companies operating in lesser populated areas?
I think it could, but I don't know that it has to. I know in the state of Indiana, I've watched many county leaders and officials working for years on broadband access and bringing some of that. And I almost at times wondered, why is that so important? I mean, I guess it should be obvious in technology, but I think these leaders have seen that the transformation that's coming for their areas of the state to be productive and to stay ahead of the curve, they've got to put, it's almost like at some point someone decided everyone's got to have clean water at easy access. Everyone's got to have, this technology piece. I do think that, and I come from a rural community in Indiana, and people are ingenious in how they deal with, they really are quite capable of doing a lot with a little. So I actually think that they can keep up and they can do it. I do think in the way that we've focused on inner city, we've got to, as leaders in cities, we've got to remember to create that connectivity ourselves. I think our collective success is as much about urban dwellers thinking about how do we reach out and make sure that we're all part of an ecosystem. We recognize we're part of that same ecosystem. So I'm hopeful about that, but I think we need to reach out.
Yeah. Let's take a look now at strategy and really going forward, looking forward as we get into hopefully at some point sooner rather than later, the post-pandemic era. And I should mention in terms of a resource, and I just thought about this, we did it recently on the show, but the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership is partnering with Cummins, among others, on I'm going to get this wrong, I think it's a go back to work playbook, essentially. And Tom Linebarger and the folks at Cummins did a phenomenal job in relaying best practices for a playbook for companies in the manufacturing sector, as well as the technology sector. There's also a playbook, I think, in the restaurant and hospitality industry. So for those out there thinking about getting back to business, the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership has what I believe is certainly billed as the most comprehensive playbook of its kind in the entire country. So that can be a resource going forward. But Rebecca, in terms of going forward and looking forward, communication is so important, as we've talked about. How do you communicate? How do leaders communicate in areas such as strategy and short and long-term vision? How do you communicate that at a time when things are still so uncertain?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the SCARF model I shared, the C stands for certainty. And so, from a brain perspective, I want to give people as much certainty as possible. And there's so much of our lives, of our day, of our work that probably is uncertain. So one advice I have is to shore up those other things around it, status and autonomy being one, but the relatedness is a big one there. And that's what the R stands for. That's helping connect people. And I know there's been some examples already shared in chat. In fact, Karen just shared an example that they were already tech enabled, but now they're using it to deepen relationships. And that is where trust is formed, to some comments that Megan has made as well. We base trust on past experiences and what we know and what's been shared with us and what we have visibility into. And that's why transparency is so important. I think in terms of strategy, it's important to be transparent about where you stand. Back to that vulnerability, clearly a theme here. But I also think you have to give people some clarity on the short term. And maybe that can only be 6 weeks for your business and not 6 months, but we know it's no longer 3 or 5 years, right? And so there's a lot out there around shorter strategic planning, more thematic, as Patrick Lencioni would call it. He's the guy who wrote the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team and some other really effective leadership books. He's got a process that we'll share out in the chat to get a team aligned on a short-term goal and the short-term activities. Again, sharing that strategic direction is really important, the highest ROI we found in research. So we know it's helpful to give people direction. We know it can't be long-term, but anything is better than nothing. And as you know, if we don't tell people, and works in about every facet of life, they will fill the blanks in with a story that is not as positive as the one that you can tell them. Even if you don't feel yours is positive, we fill the blanks in with something even more negative. So we've got to fill the blanks where we can.
Yeah, good stuff. Megan, what are you hearing? Can you talk at all about what you're hearing from folks out there in terms of what they're most interested in or concerned about as they look to the future, the reopening process? What some of those really hot button issues are for folks?
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing on the ground is kind of that tension between how to deal with things at the macro level. So when you're looking at how am I going to set guidelines, short-term and long-term, as Rebecca just said, what are our plans, what are the expectations, but then bringing them down to the personal level, having those one-on-ones and realizing that each person's situation is different, and then how to translate those short and long-term objectives at the business level or at the organization level down to the individual level. Because I think right now, in this case of extreme uncertainty, any little bit of certainty that we can gain in our lives is really precious. And when you've got things kind of hitting at you from all sides, your kids' summer camps are canceled and you've got, clients who now want you to come back to work or different things, trying to balance that together is important. And I think now more than ever, as people have shared in the chat, I think Karen was the last one to share it, we have such a window into our colleagues' personal lives and kind of what they're going for or going through. I feel like we really have a high obligation to recognize that and to act with a lot of care in how we work with that information and try to give them certainty in different areas. So I think bridging that gap is what I've heard a lot of.
Very good. Brian, in terms of long-term impacts on the business, on your business, have you made changes Is this an opportunity for companies, obviously, to really re-examine that long-term vision and goals and make some moves or do some things? Hey, Brian,
You're on.
hit your mute.
The solution to this, I would pay significant dollars. I think that to create a new reality in the future beyond what you've done today, you have to create new skills, new experiences, new capacities. And so I think this experience has sort of fast forwarded a whole bunch of experiences. Just even thinking about the digital experience, working virtually, work from home, all those issues that all of us have been dancing around for years, suddenly just became the norm. And we walked through that change process so fast, it would have taken 5 more years. So I think that's a really positive thing that we can focus on, and that perhaps we've got the potential to go further faster than we thought.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm looking for opportunities in our own business. I see our customers finding that. The HBR article talks about that in a moment of crisis, creating an inflection point. I think from our vantage point as a business, simple things like we've been doing open enrollment meetings for years. Sometimes we do them on a screen, sometimes we do them in person. Nobody really likes going to those things. It's awkward. People kind of want it more on demand. So a great opportunity is, how do we create that as a digital experience where people get what they want when they want it? More of a YouTube type of experience. Get it when I need it. Access a human being when I want to talk versus, kind of being talked at. Churches have dealt with this for years too. Like, people just don't want to be talked at. They want to interact. They want to get what they want to kind of free play it as they go. So I think digital opportunities are tremendous. Rebecca mentioned a customer where, a 5-year out plan, fast forwarded to today, that's very real and very practical for that business and many. So fast forwarding those digital opportunities, I think is a real possibility right now.
Yeah. I want to give everyone a chance to give some final thoughts. But before that, Brian, just anecdotally, what's your sense in terms of the mindset of leaders around the state of Indiana, corporate leadership, nonprofit leadership? Is it cautious optimism? I mean, it's tough to be optimistic in this environment, but how would you sense the feeling is out there as leaders look to the future and look to what this quote unquote new norm is going to be like going forward?
I think there are pockets of optimism. I think cautiously optimistic is the pervasive evaluation of it. I think I think what governments and what not-for-profits and other entities have done to support this short term is stabilizing for a lot of people. It's like, you know what, we can find ways to support each other through really difficult things. And you'd like to think that's true any day, but you see it become reality right here in the midst of this. Think about how many things had to happen in a short period of time just for us to get where we are today. Mm-hmm. I think one thing I worry about is, will we become a little too loose and a little too forget some of what we've learned and gained here, and not be prepared for the next wave and the things that are coming next. And I think it would be really proper to focus on what's possible, but also remember what else can happen, and just be as prepared as we can be for those things and ready to flip and pivot, which I know we can do based on our past experience. But the brain tends to fall back into patterns. And I think as leaders, keeping ourselves aware and helping our people be aware of what's real is important. Yeah.
I know a couple of the comments talked about the governor's back on track plan and using that kind of as a template, if you will, or guidepost for reopening their individual businesses. It made me think, I had a conversation last week with Roger Penske, and if you can imagine the enormous logistics and decisions that have to be made regarding getting racing going again. He made the statement there will be racing July 4th at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, whether it's with or without fans. And he talked about the need to work with state and local officials. But he also said, which I thought was interesting, he said racers are tough, and we've got to have a tough mindset going forward to make decisions and to have the grit and the determination to make things happen. I think there's an element of that as well going forward for a lot of companies and a lot of leaders around the state of Indiana. For some final thoughts, and Rebecca, I'll throw it to you, but as we kind of wrap up and folks get back to work and are looking ahead at what's next, your thoughts.
Yeah, I think what's next is a transformation, kind of an industrial revolution of the digital age, right? For us, that will bring about products, services, employee, possibly, benefits, things that we don't ever even think about providing that will be necessary. I think things will become more individualized, and we won't be thinking so in the masses. We will think very much to a person, and that I think our technologies will get us to the point where that's possible. So I see some cool things coming, and I'm super excited for where this could be. I don't mean to not have, I guess rose-colored glasses are possible with me. I'm pretty optimistic as a result. But I think we're going to be in for some wake-up calls, right, still to come, as Brian mentioned, next waves. I mean, we just don't know. It's hard to predict. But I see us being resilient, rising to the challenge, and I think there's going to be some cool things to come as a result.
Yeah, very good. Megan, your some final thoughts.
Really, not just having remote option strategy. I think that will have a huge impact on talent and recruiting and kind of open up a lot of doors. I think I'm just biased, but Indiana, we're a great community. I could see a lot of people wanting to hopefully move here and enjoy the life that we have here and work for maybe other companies that aren't here. But I think, to me, the biggest part, I do think it's going to be more individualized to what Rebecca just shared. But at the same time, I think throughout this entire crisis, we've developed in a lot of ways a greater sense of community and dialogue among all of us. And I think that's been one of the great byproducts of all of this. And I really hope, and I'm hopeful, that that will continue going forward and that we can really build on our sense of community, even though physically we've been apart. So
that's a great point on that community building aspect of the pandemic. Brian, I'll give you the floor for some final thoughts.
Well, Gary, I appreciate your work here today and helping us bring forward some of these ideas. I know there's a ton of resources that we shared here. This is a topic that could go on for a long time. I think the thing I'm encouraged by is we have resilience in Indianapolis and in the region and in the state, and I believe that we will come out better than many. And I think we've proven that time and again. The example of CICP and what they've created, and Mitch Daniels' commitment at Purdue, I do think it's a balance, and you said it, a balance of grit and just we're going to make something happen, and also being thoughtful, and that makes for pretty good outcomes. So we'll stay tuned. We're in it to win it.
Very good. I like that, Brian, very much. Thank you all for participating. Thanks to the audience for being there and engaging in this, what I think is important dialogue and information. Brian Brenner is the CEO and the founder at First Person. Megan Nail, Vice President of Total Rewards Practice there. Rebecca Ellis, the Managing Director at the Performance Lab at First Person. Thanks for some really great perspective. And certainly we at Inside Indiana Business love the partnership with First Person as well. And I think as a reminder to everyone who is connected, I think you'll be receiving an email with access to all of the resources that we presented today. And with that, I'll just say so long and good luck. And as we go forward as a state, I think it's been talked about by the panelists here today. I think Indiana is positioned as well as any state in the country to weather this. We've got great companies, resilient companies, organizations, communities. I think we'll come out of this just fine. Maybe a few bumps in the road ahead, but I think over the long term, we'll be just fine. So again, thank you to everyone for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Gary.